G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, sometimes known as the Bloke. Here with the book review of Desertphile, the novel by David Rice. Stick around, it's a good book. Desertphile is the YouTube channel name of David Rice. He and I have been co-subscribers for 5 years, 6 years, something like that. And his book is exactly what it says it is. He tells us how and why he came to think it was a clever idea to go and live in a cave in the Avawatz Mountains in the East Mojave Desert and stay there for 29 months. And from his journal, he reconstructs vignettes, events, stories, interesting stuff that happened while he was off in the wilderness. And instead of telling you about it, I'm going to read you some of it. Being an advanced copy, I had to number the pages myself. We'll take this up towards the end of a mine of her own, when, because he'd been living in the desert for a while and there had been a lot of mining happen in the desert, old mate started to fantasise about having a little mine of his own. Okay, we take up the story. I fished my binoculars out of my backpack, stood, stretched my cramped legs and turned westward. I was once again awed at the rugged geology of the Avawatz, the number of places where gold lode could have formed and then weathered away as nuggets and dust to collect in the washes, alluvial fans, pans, depressions carved by wind and blown sand, and ancient stream beds must number in the tens of thousands. The trick was to find an area not too far from my spring for me to haul buckets of dirt from below or inside what had once been a quartz deposit that was loaded with black sand and gold dust. It was a haystack 700 feet tall and 30 miles wide, within which a few dozen golden needles might be hidden. Scanning the east-facing cliffs, valleys, rocky ledges and crenellated ridges with my binoculars, I spotted an alluvial fan that I judged to be half a mile away, wedged between two monolithic towers made of ancient basalt or jasper, the colour of sun-baked blood. Perhaps tens of thousands of years ago, a creek had flowed between the two towers, carrying gold with it. Later erosion would then have built the alluvial fan. The pointed end of the fan and the space between the two dark red spires I judged to be about 15 feet wide. The base of the fan appeared to be about 7 times that width, about 100 feet. The alluvial fan was perhaps 40 feet tall, from the narrow end at the top to the wide end at the bottom. Without knowing the distance between me and the fan, it was not easy to estimate the size. I lowered my binoculars, turned back around to gaze eastwards for a few minutes, then turned westward again. My gaze searched a few seconds for the fan and found it again. I repeated the process a few times until I could find the fan instantly without the binoculars. I plotted my approach until the setting sun blotted out my sight. Next chapter. This boot was made for walking. Quote, he gave the impression of being a man who knew the world was crazy and had decided to become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. By Warren Murphy. A few minutes after the sun set, the evening temperature plunged from too hot to bear to too cold to bear. It was as if someone up there had closed the doors of hell and kicked the doors of Niflheim wide open. The transition was so sudden that I imagined seeing frost giants flood into Midgard, bracket Earth, to use the Avawatz as a footstool. Shivering in the quickly darkening dusk, I carefully picked my way off the rock wall and retreated to my blankets and sleep. Pulling the edge of my blankets to my chin, I noticed Orion already high in the sky. If I had been able to look eastward through the rocky hill behind my back, I could have seen Sirius low on the horizon. The winter months had arrived. Chilled, blankets warming slowly, I slept. I was awakened by a scream. For a second or two, my mind flashed back to my thoughts of the ghost of Coyote Hole Spring the day before, and I thought I might be lucky enough to be haunted. The sound resolved itself to a squeak that ended abruptly, located perhaps 10 feet above where I was laying. the chiffonic silhouette of a large owl, grasping a now quiet victim in her fists, blotted out a path through the stars on wings so silently beating that I only heard the wind passing through her feathers. Well, that was unpleasant, I told the night, shivering more from dread than the cold. What? I'm next, is it? A friendly warning, eh? I'd fucking love to see the owl large enough to haul my fat ass away. I immediately wished I hadn't said that, tempting fate as it did, and I tightened my blankets more firmly around my throat, where a vague terror had taken hold, my eyes wide and staring into the murderous, ominous, ill-omened night. After a few minutes, when the night became too quiet, I became convinced an owl 40 feet tall was about to carry me off to her nest of 6-foot-tall babies somewhere up in the crags and clefts of Averwat's Peak. I thought about making a run for it to my cave, but the night was cold, my blankets were warm, and I fell back to sleep before choosing between the cold and a beaked, clawed avian death. The sun rose once again, driving away the dreams of my many improbable and impossible deaths. I rose from my blankets, stomped my feet hard to get the cold out of them. I put on my hat, I pulled on my socks, I shook the dirt out of my shirt and put it on. I pulled on my pants, leaving the zipper open briefly to let little Davy enjoy the morning sun a few seconds longer. I zipped up and then put on one boot. One boot, which had been placed next to its twin the night before, was missing. Somewhere in Germany, surely, there are legends of trolls that take people's boots at night, probably when snow is falling. But this was the United States of goddamned America, where no such troll behaviour was tolerated. Oops, where such troll behaviour was not tolerated. There is a hell of a lot of salt in the East Mojave Desert, and more than enough to go around in the Averwat's mountain range, but some furry beastie out there wanted salty leather and had carried off my sweat-dabbled boot. I wondered how far a skunk could drag a boot. Further than a squirrel, surely. Not as far as a raccoon. I had no idea. I figured the boot was probably far down a coyote's burrow by now, being enjoyed by coyote pups. Mother coyote saving the heel for some special Canis latrans occasion. Getting on my hands and knees, I studied the ground where I had placed both boots. The ground was well trampled by my feet, bare and booted, in a circle at least 20 feet wide. So I crawled in a spiral until I found marks that might possibly be that of a boot being dragged. When I found such a mark, I placed a small pile of rocks next to it. I continued to crawl in an ever-widening spiral about 50 feet until I came hard up on the east side of the arroyo. I then sat at the opening of my cave and looked at the several dozen piles of rocks I had made. Among the chaotically spaced rocks, a distinct line of rocks was apparent. I set off, back on my hands and knees, in slow, delayed, rather comical but relentless pursuit. Northward I crawled, picking up signs of a dragged boot more easily as I strayed away from my lonely habitat. The signs of the ground being disturbed were faint, shallow, but distinct, and at each mark I placed more piles of rocks. If I lost the trail, I wanted to be able to easily locate the mark I thought was the last, and the small piles of rocks would let me do that. Whatever carried off my boot was in the mood to travel, the bastard. Up the arroyo I crawled, over patches of sand, between boulders, through clumps of dirt and dry, brittle brown grass. The sun rose over the east edge of the arroyo, and the gates of hell were again propped open. Onward I crawled. The arroyo split in two and the trail took the left-hand fork. The sand in this arroyo was packed harder. Perhaps with subsurface water that, further down the drainage I was crawling over, provided the water for me at my spring. The harder sand made tracking the wandering boot more difficult, and every mark took many minutes to find. The drainage system I was crawling through, tracking a boot that apparently was too heavy for the bandit, the brigand, the larcenist to lift off the ground for very long, was fed by many dozens of washers, and during a hard rain the washers funneled rills of water onto the main arroyo. That water resurfaced the sand, leaving a series of corrugated trenches that cut through the otherwise flat and smooth sand. The ground was heavily littered with the tracks of birds, hares, snakes, lizards, coyotes, rats, and what I can only imagine was a tortoise, with its 4 flipper-like swimming motion footpads. Picking out the marks of a boot being dragged a bit, lifted a ways, dropped and dragged again, quickly grew tedious, and I considered giving up and hopping one-footed into town to buy new boots. At any moment I expected my wandering boot to deviate from the main channel and take a side channel somewhere. I considered myself lucky the highwayman couldn't pick up the boot and climb out of the arroyo with it onto the hard pan and rocks. If that happened, I would never be able to track it. I slithered northeast up a side wash, crept a few dozen feet, placing little rocks next to boot marks, then dragged my body northward again up yet another side wash. At a patch of gravel where several washes joined at a wide sandy beach about 80 feet wide, no mark was left that I could detect. I spent more than 1 hour slowly crawling around through the gravel before I found a few marks that might have been made from dragging a boot. It took another hour to select the correct mark and continue the goddamn quest for the goddamn travelling boot. God damn it! Funny, Dave, I thought you were an atheist. The sun crossed the meridian and made its way westward. Onward I crawled, feeling exploited, abused, persecuted, and poorly treated. When my hands and knees were sufficiently sore and my back in agony, fate allowed that the tracks ended at a large clump of rabbit brush where my well-gnawed boot rested. The laces up to the eye holes had been eaten. The insides of the uppers had been gobbled up, including the nylon padding. The soft rubber insert where my heel once toiled as I hiked had been sampled also and evidently found unpalatable as it was nibbled but left intact. I removed the lace that remained, slammed the boot on the ground against to dislodge any one that might be inside, and put the meandering boot on my socked foot. With the partial lace, I tied the boot on as best I could. Standing up was a struggle, accompanied by stabbing pain in my back, but once on my feet, I felt human again. I gave my foot a shake or two, with the boot wobbling loosely, and followed my little piles of rocks back to my cave. Tracking the boot had taken me almost 7 hours. That night I slept with my boots on. My fabulous newfound wealth. If anyone in Texas is reading this, nice to know you have internet access in your tree. Greg Layden. I felt guilty as I lay on my tarp under the blankets, staring up at the stars, boots on. I thought about the immense toil and time it took me to find my purloined boot. Whoever had taken it must have worked just as hard to drag it away, but with a vastly different mindset than I. She or he must have been overwhelmed with happiness at finding a leather boot to eat, and my taking it away must have been a great and sad disappointment to whoever. The more I thought about it, the worse I felt. I had deprived some small, furry, presumably desert wilderness denizen, her or his legitimate right to salvage and eat anything that might be discovered. Perhaps there were babies to be fed, called from their den to gather around the boot and chew on it like a family at a fat Christmas goose. It rankled my mind with shame. I flung my blankets away, grabbed my flashlight, and stumbled to my cave in the dark. Inside the cave, I opened the ammo can that held saltine crackers and fished out a package, a stack of 10 crackers, each perforated into quarters for easy breaking, wrapped it tightly in waxed paper. I sealed the can and opened the can that held graham crackers. After taking out a package of these sweet crackers, I rummaged through my sliced bread can and found half a dozen stale pieces. Into the cold and dark I groped and blundered, using the flashlight to find my trail of rocks and sand piles. In another chapter he mentions he's got almost no night vision. My trail of rocks and sand piles, wending yet again the tortuous route northward up the arroyo, then northwest, then west, then north again, covering the same ground on my feet that I had covered on my knees the day before. At the rabbit brush where my boot had been, I opened up the packages of crackers and carefully laid them on the ground. I placed the stale bread on top of the crackers. "I'm sorry," I said, loud enough to be heard by anyone in the neighbourhood. I explained to the knight at considerable length why I needed the boot. Eventually I started to feel silly. I apologised again, then rushed back to my bed. As it says, it is hilarious. Fantastic. It's a cynical, outrageous, politically incorrect, foul-mouthed and absolutely hilarious modern-day Walden, said Douglas Preston. It's original, fresh, full of humour, and I'll be damned if there wasn't a moral in there too. It's the kind of stuff the world needs. Jan Atlee Ramsley. Basically, I suppose you could say that 12 years as an information technologist working on big computers drove Desertphile off to go and live in a cave. And after 29 months of living in a cave, he'd had enough. He had a cranky jack moment where he saw his own reflection when he went to town to buy supplies, and he decided that was it. That's enough. He'd spent enough time in the wilderness. And though I speak as a different kind of a hermit in a different kind of a wilderness, I greatly enjoyed Desertphile the novel, and I suspect you will too. Not only did I enjoy myself greatly, I learned a fair bit about the Eastern Mojave Desert and Dave's view on life on Earth. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.